Hi, everyone. My name is Jason Matthews, and thank you very much for tuning in. We're running a panel today for winter quarters entitled Wargaming Africa. And I am joined by two accomplished designers who have games on that subject. We may be joined also a little bit by one of the Ragnar brothers who has one of the foundational games on that subject. But in the meantime, we'll get going and talk a little bit about our experiences in this arena and with conflicts in Africa, and address to a great extent why there are so few games in this area and what we can do to get a little more interest in it. Um, I'm going to ask Brian and then Yann to introduce themselves, talk a little bit about the games that they've designed in this, and then we'll start with the questions. Brian.
Thanks, Jason. So as advertised, my name is Brian Train. I've been designing war games for about 30 years. I have around 65, 70 designs in the can. As far as African designs go, I have several games on the Algerian Independence War, Algeria Colonial Twilight, which is a GMT coin system game I think most people will be familiar with, and District Commander Zone Nord Oranais. I've also designed a game about almost 30 years ago on Somalia, interventions in Somalia, almost contemporary to the time of the battle in Mogadishu that most people are aware of. Other than that, I haven't done much about Africa, and it's something that I've always wanted to get done, but something has always kind of intervened.
There. Yeah.
Okay, so my name is Yann de Villeneuve. I'm the antithesis of Brian, since I only have one design that partakes to today's subjects. The game I'm working on is called A Fading Star. It's currently on GMT P500, and this is volume 15 in the coin series, with a focus on the Somali civil war between 2007 and 2014, so quite modern.
For sure. Well, first off, Jan, tell us a little bit about how the P500 is going and what news from Gene about when you might actually have physical copies in your hand.
It's going well. So we made the cut last year, nearly a few months after the P500 campaign launched. As people may know, right now the coin pipeline is kind of busy, so we are waiting on other volumes to release. But I think 2024 will be the year where I think we'll get the heart done probably, and then Joe DeWorst will start working on the solo design, the solo boats using like the Gandhi system, the card system. So right now, I believe probably 2025 is a safe bet for the release, for the physical release of the game. But otherwise, we're doing quite down.
So, Brian, you're sort of the foremost designer, I would say, of unconventional conflicts. Conflicts less than war. You have a number of designs in this kind of space. Tell us a little bit about how you were drawn to Algeria in particular, and what's interesting about, and maybe talk a little bit about what it is that's singular about that conflict that isn't true in some of the others that you've designed on.
Thanks, Jason. I wouldn't call myself foremost so much as maybe persistent. I'm like the guy who keeps knocking at the door, won't go away. That doesn't make my work good. But as I said, I've been designing one. You've noted that most of my work does deal with irregular warfare, unconventional warfare, counterinsurgency, call it whatever you want. And that was a very, very early design interest of mine and always has been. I started playing war games in 1979, 1980. And from the very start, I wanted to play games on the wars that were going on around me, at the time, or had recently been concluded. And this, of course, was at a time when it was even difficult to get a game on Vietnam into print, let alone, all of the things that were going on in Africa and Asia and so forth at the time. So after a while, I started to design games myself because nobody was designing or publishing the kind of games that I wanted to play. So, I created that. I've always had this interest in irregular warfare, but particularly in urban irregular warfare. And one of the best examples of urban irregular warfare campaigns is, of course, the Battle of Algiers that the French fought in the city of Algiers in 1957. And I used to write a lot of articles for Strategy and Tactics magazine. And the first long piece that I had published in that magazine was in 1993 on urban guerrilla warfare generally. So in there, I wrote about the Tupamaros and, Aoka, a lot of other things. But I also wrote a lot about Algiers. So in doing the research for that, I was very interested in the Battle of Algiers. And I thought that it would be a good idea to try and make a game about it. But before that, I was more interested in doing a game on the Algerian War of Independence more generally, the entire war, whereas the Battle of Algiers was just a campaign. I still haven't gotten around to doing that game just on the Battle of Algiers, although I've designed a good dozen games on urban insurgency, both generic and historically based. I may be starting work finally on a Battle of Algiers game with someone in the near future. I hope to get started on that this year, so I can remedy that. But in the meantime, I did design a game on the Battle of, on the Algerian War of Independence. And it was published by Microgame Design Group in sort of like a simple, DTP, desktop published format in 2000. And as time went on, it was picked up by one publisher or another, had better and better components as things went on. The design also evolved a little bit. The best and final edition of that particular game is produced by One Small Step now in folio format. And that ran that out. It was at the time when it came out in 2000, it was the first game on the Algerian War to appear in any language. And it's always been interesting to me. I don't know if Yann, you have a comment on this about the particular amnesia that the Algerian War has, or at least used to have, as far as I know, in French politics and society. Because, it's obvious that the aftermath of the Algerian independence war has poisoned French politics and society for many years. And yet it wasn't even acknowledged as a war by the French government until, I believe, late in the 1990s. So again, I had always thought that there might be something, available in French about this, but no, there wasn't. So instead, there was this, and it came out. And through a string of circumstances, Volko Runke got his hands on a copy, and it gave him some inspiration when he was working out the GMT coin system. And so that began with Ande and Abyss. A couple of years later, I worked with Volko on A Distant Plain, where the American theory of counterinsurgency was partly informed by the theories of David Galula, who was an officer in the French army during Algeria. And then finally, Colonial Twilight. So that was the third game ever designed on the war as a whole. In the middle, there was a game by Kim Kanger called Ici c'est la France. So that's where that came from. How the Algerian Independence War is different from others is that it was one of a certain type of irregular conflict, an independence war. And it was an independence war that was a bit different in that it had an extraterritorial sanctuary where have been some independence wars that are like that. For example, Stephen Reganzas, of course, in the British way, has come out with this quad of games, and he talks about extraterritorial sanctuaries in the Malaya game. And about 14 years ago, I designed a game on Cyprus, the independence Cyprus movement called Ioka, and they had a sort of sanctuary back in Greece. And of course, in the Algerian War, you had Morocco and Tunisia that were former French colonies that became independent. And yet there are other independence struggles or internal struggles that don't have an extraterritorial sanctuary like that. For example, I did a game on the Shining Path guerrillas of Peru. And that was a purely internal struggle. And I think that's a mark of some conflicts in sub-Saharan Africa, is that they are internal and largely tribal-based conflicts. And where there's extraterritoriality involved, it's because the tribal territory transcends the artificially imposed political and administrative boundary that the former imperial powers imposed on them. Again, you see this in A Distant Plain, for example, where the Pashtun nation is divided in half by the Durand line between Afghanistan and Pakistan. That was just a line drawn on the map by Mr. Durand. And as far as British colonial policy goes, that was quite deliberate at the time. Anyway. Hey, I see we have Phil.
Hello,
Phil.
I'm sorry.
Welcome.
I think the time difference caught me out somewhere along the way, but I am here now.
We are happy to have you, and I apologize. We have Yann is in Japan, Brian is in British Columbia, Phil is in the UK, I'm in DC. So the sun never sets on this panel, I suppose. Before I turn to Yann with a secondary question, Phil, we'd introduced ourselves briefly, so if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about the Ragnar brothers and Angola, your amazing addition to this subject.
Oh, you're so kind, sir. Yes, I'm Phil Kendall. I'm one of the three Ragnar brothers. Two of us are brothers and one isn't. And I had the pleasure of designing the very first Ragnar Brothers game, which was Angola, of course. And since then we have produced, I think, something like about 25 titles over the last 35 years of different levels of success. Yeah, Angola, with the help of Roger Greenwood, came out in 1988, and as I say, it set us on our path to glory, I suppose.
For sure. Yann, Brian raised a couple of issues that are interesting there that I wanted to follow up with you on. The French-Algerian War is, of course, colonial conflict, which is the nature of a couple of the games that are out in the space of modern Africa. But your game is focused on another component of that, which is kind of these failed state crises that we've had both in East Africa and West Africa, and tragically have kind of characterized the conflicts that have occurred in Africa more recently. So I'm curious what drew you to that, and even more curious why the first game design that you ever did would be about something like Somalia.
All right, thank you for the question, Jason. So to answer the latter first, I used to be a serviceman in the French Air Force, and as part of this duty, I got deployed in the Horn of Africa back in 2012, on the year 2012, and this mission was anti-piracy. And at this time, well, it was a great experience, personal experience. Somalia for me was not something I knew at the time. And years later, when I joined the Coin Discord community, it was very active during the COVID years, I found out people were using their own experience or their own research to try to model some things through the coin system. And I was like, hey, maybe I could try that. And that worked out quite well. And through this experience, myself, I wanted to dive in more into the story of this country, what's going on since since the 1990s, which I think where most people stop thinking about Somalia as a whole, you know. So diving into the research was what got me hooked into making this design. At first it was just making a map, and then after that I was like, all right, now I will start reading the literature, and I found very interesting findings on the state of not only Somalia but also the new post-Cold War, I guess you could call that post-Cold War, the post-colonialism dynamism between countries in Africa. I think in your own game, Jason, you modeled the importance of Somalia and Ethiopia. We have learnings on what are the relationship between all those countries that are quite fragile or still quite new, that are finding the identity, and that are part that's what motivated me. Into making this game, among many other reasons. Sorry, I think you had another question, the former question, I think I forgot.
No, I think that was both of them. Why Somalia, and why these kinds of internal conflicts, what were attractive? Phil, you must have been designing Angola, well, certainly while the Cold War was still going on, but also while the conflict was relatively fresh. In fact, I guess in some regards was still going on in the late 80s, or at least there was various forms of conflict over Namibia and the other Southwest African states there.
27 years that the conflict went
exactly.
on. Still going in the early 21st century.
Yeah, precisely. So what was and the Angolan Civil War, I think for most Americans would be rather one of the more obscure conflicts in Africa, even though it was clearly an element of U.S. foreign policy at the time. But what was the draw for an Englishman to with so many colonial conflicts to choose from? Why the Portuguese in Southwest Africa?
Well, I think it's just as remote for people in the UK as it is for people in the US. I was at that time in the mid-80s. The Ragnars were just at the stage of actually moving from wargaming, which is what a lot of us did, into board gaming. And at the time, the inspiration, I'm not sure that's the right word, but the motivation for it, I came across an article in Strategy and Tactics, which is basically almost a chronological map of the entire war, plus a hex grid map of the terrain as they envisaged it might be. And the subject, I suppose, fascinated me. The sense of the ebb and flow of the conflict. I'd got various game systems in my mind that I was wanting to perhaps create a game around, and Angola came along and it basically fitted an awful lot of those board game criteria. In terms of how it came across to me as a conflict, I suppose, I had followed the 1973 Arab-Israeli war quite closely, and from a military history point of view, a lot of the features of that particular conflict were there in what was going on in Angola, in terms of, you know, the military hardware and the how the military operations were organized. So my interest comes from less of the history of Angola, more from, you know, the possibilities it opened up to us as something to simulate.
Fascinating. That is a super interesting insight that an early article in Strategy and Tactics kind of spawned Angola in that regard.
Well, we all have a starting point. You know, if you ask any writer, they will say, "Oh, yes, it was such and such a conversation that set me on the road." And you know, I mean, I'm generally interested in history. Well, I am you know, I have a history degree. Military history fascinates me, and as I say, Angola seemed to be the subject that met that sweet spot at that particular moment in time.
Indeed. Brian.
I think that I remember the article that Phil is talking about, and I think that it
Wow.
was presented as an expansion or a variant to a game that SPI put out in Strategy and Tactics magazine in 1977 called South Africa. And that was
yes.
the first war game I ever played on a sub-Saharan African subject. And I was playing it in 1980. It was one of the first dozen war games that I picked up, and I played it a lot. It was a really fascinating game for me. Because the challenge, of course, is that, you know, there were many strikes against it because it's a modern period game. It doesn't involve Americans. You know, only one side could win the game. In that sense, it's also a game about a failed state. And that mechanically to me, or mechanically and thematically, that was interesting to me as to how you can keep the wheels turning in a failed state. How long can you go? So South Africa, I would count as a failed state politically, maybe not economically, but certainly politically. And I played it a lot. And the challenge, of course, is how to keep the South African army running, you know, as the economy is crumbling and country is crumbling around it. But it's interesting what you mentioned earlier about failed states. There was another game that came out much later in Strategy and Tactics called Chad. That was about the situation there, and you could see some lineage between South Africa and Chad about, you know, trying to keep the economy going, and so forth. And then later on, Liberia by Ben Madison, of course, is another game about a failed state. And of course, you know, we've done games on, there's a few games on Somalia now. I did a game on Somalia in 1994 about the time that, as Yann pointed out, people stopped thinking about Somalia. I did a 2002 scenario for that game later on when it looked like the United States might invade Somalia in pursuit of Al-Qaeda, but it never happened. And of course, Yann's game focuses on the 2007 to 2014 timeframe, but of course it was informed by 30 years of collapse that came before it. So there's something about the idea of keeping a state running, you know, that thematically to me was interesting. And I've tried to reflect that in a couple of my other games. For example, I've done a game on the Tupamaros of Uruguay, where you kind of have to keep the Uruguayan government and security apparatus going. And Shining Path, you know, about Sendero Luminoso of Peru, where the economy is also, you know, under threat. So to me, that was an interesting part. What kind of drew me to these kinds of conflicts. And of course, as we pointed out, there are few enough of these, but they certainly represent a lot of potential, along a very interesting theme of sort of impending doom, the important sound of things falling apart, as they used to say.
I mean, following on from that, a later game that we produced was DR Congo, which was exactly what you're just saying now, which is we got a few strange looks when it first came out, because people felt that what was a very serious subject, which was the state of, how the DR Congo was functioning as a state, we chose to take the view that if this factor was helpful, and if this factor was in place, and if this factor was in place, what might possibly have been achieved by that state, successfully developing the industry and the infrastructure needed to, become a much more better functioning state in Africa. So, again, it is an interesting subject to explore, isn't it?
I'm glad you raised that experiment, Phil, because I was one of the people who raised his eyebrow when I saw that game came out.
All right.
And then when I read a little further into what you were trying to do with that design, I was like, oh, this is actually quite a noble undertaking, and we need more of this rather than less. To that point, Yann, since you are probably half the age of the other three of us, can you...
That's very generous.
Yes.
I'm aging Yann and being polite to us. Can you talk a little bit? I think it's a happy trend that we see in contemporary game design, where the victims of imperialism, either in its classical form or its more contemporary approaches, game design is trying to give them a bit more agency in games. We're producing a lot fewer happy romps through through Rhodes's fantasies in Africa and whatnot, and trying to represent a little more the experience of the people in dealing with the imperialist powers. It seems to me that your game is a fine example of that. And can you talk a little bit about why you wanted to approach the subject in that way? And does the fact that you are from one of the great imperial powers impact your thinking in this regard?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, it is a very interesting matter. So in A Fading Star, all players actually play an African faction, be it a Somali faction in the government, the Al-Shabaab, or the pirates, which also include the civil society, some of the civil society elements, but also the African Union mission in Somalia. And the interest, I think, is, all right, we could label that it's an African solution to an African problem, but like, what are the implications of having only African actors? It's all glitter and, not really. And there are, as I was mentioning, in this post-colonial era, we have new trends, new relationship between those countries. So in the case of Somalia, we had the case of Somalia irredentism, I think that's the word. Like there is a Somali community both in Kenya and in Ethiopia, and also Djibouti, because of the after effect of colonialism. Like the borders were drawn using the actual borders between like the French and the English and Italian Somalia, and that divided people. And this created, tension that led to the Ogaden War, for example, in the 70s. And all this heritage is accumulating even now today. So for people who follow the news, for example, right now the headline in Somalia is not like the civil war, it's not Al-Shabaab, but it's like the encroachment of Ethiopia in Somali affairs. They are trying to build a base. They're trying to get a sea access using, the splits between Somali faction, between like Somaliland and like the federal government, and it's creating a whole new problem for the Somali government. And in the Fading Star, we are not only seeing things we are seeing in a distant plane, for example, like all the counter-insurgency issues, but also, okay, we have this African Union mission in Somalia that is providing peacekeepers and peace enforcer because they're also fighting. Some of those countries are contributing for prestige, but also we have Ethiopia and Kenya who have this, two-way diplomacy with Somalia who's helping, but also it's self-serving. They are occupying and they didn't really ask for the intervention. They kind of went for it. So what those dynamism, what are those action imply, and what are the lessons for us in the West? What are those things that we didn't see before? In wargaming, between regional power emerging like Ethiopia and minor power like Somalia that is raising from a statehood that was not existent 2 decades ago, and that are trying to create new states. Yes, I think that's those aspects. Those aspects which I hope we can find in a new design about Africa.
For sure, Phil. In a lot of important ways, Angola is ahead of its time, and one of the ways in which it's ahead of its time is that it is a conflict that sort of anticipates the coin system, in that you have players who are cooperating but are clearly operating with different agendas, and it also has this sort of wry commentary on the Cold War about how does a client state actually get more money out of the United States or the Soviet Union? And the answer that your game provides is that you need to be losing mostly. Not too badly. There's a happy medium there, but if you're going to get more weapons, you have to show that you need them. Talk a little bit about how you arrived at those design decisions, and do you see all of these kinds of conflicts with that same cynical lens?
Oh, right. Yeah, the basically, say the chronology of the war is very much one side would be on the up and the other side would be on the down, and the backers of the side that were down would put in enough to nudge them up above, and then the other side would do the same, and so on. So almost like literally like a seesaw in terms of the balance up and down. I was thinking earlier about it, in many ways not dissimilar to World War II in North Africa, where the Allies and the Axis, they would do enough to give themselves the momentum, but because of all the other considerations that they had in the wider conflict, they would only go so far, which was never enough to end the conflict, but just enough to encourage the other side to do their bit of topping up as well. There's a card mechanism in Angola where players can bid for how much indirect aid they're hoping to get from their backers. And in a way, that almost sums up the bigger picture within the war, in that you are trying to ask for enough to fulfill, to achieve what you're needing, but not so much as to tilt public opinion against you. You're looking for this sweet spot, which is you're not needing quite as much extra help as the other side are needing. And again, I think that almost sums up the conflict as a whole. You use the word wry, which is it's quite a nice word to sum it up, because there are. I mean, it was a terrible conflict with, getting on for 1 million people killed as a result of it, but yet, there is snippets of humour within the game still, which on occasions makes me feel a little uncomfortable. The arrival of the Bulgarian cultural attaché is one of the card bonuses you get, which basically gives you nothing whatsoever. So, that side of it does concern me at times.
That is a super interesting point, and I want to turn back to it in a moment. But Brian, one of the things that I think is a little bit of an inhibitor with design in the African space is sourcing. Like, where do you get an order of battle for these countries? Where can you get reliable information? I mean, not just on unit sizes and capabilities and equipment, but actually what happened. Because in many cases, it's a little fuzzier than we would like for purposes of designing a game. But you've done a lot of conflicts like this. So tell me a little bit about your methodology for addressing a conflict of this nature where facts might be mushier than we like.
Yeah, I take your comment about orders of battle. I'm not like a lot of other game designers where I tend not to be very nitty-picky about orders of battle at all, because the order of battle that you had historically is just one of many that could have been in place at the time. And of course, everybody knows the moment you take the first move in a war game, right away history's gone off the rails. Unless you're following a completely scripted game, and following like a tutorial scenario, point by point. So again, it's like that quote from Hugh Trevor Roper: "History is what actually happened in the context of what could have happened at the time," and that's the kind of, well, sort of a laissez-faire approach that I take to it when I can with these kinds of games. So, for example, there's a contrast I mentioned earlier that I did the first game ever on the Algerian Independence War and the third game on the Algerian Independence War. And both of those games are fairly abstract in their treatment of orders of battle. But the second one in the middle, Ici c'est la France by Kim Kanger, was actually quite accurate in terms of regimental designations and, that sort of thing. Whereas I left it kind of loose, because as far as I was concerned, exact, counting rifles in rifle battalions didn't matter too much. What was important was that, there was a certain amount of force available in a particular area at a particular time, and that's what contributed to what happened and what didn't happen. There's another notion that I've thought of, and this kind of comes out in the coin system games, for example, in that the cubes and cylinders and things like that pop up on a coin system game, they aren't the actual order of battle. They aren't the actual forces involved. I've always thought of it in sort of like the difference between potential energy and kinetic energy in a system. If you remember your physics class, every system, has a combination of potential and kinetic energy in it. And the energy in the system is always, shifting back and forth between potential and kinetic. So an example there is in Colonial Twilight, for example, to take that particular game, is the police cubes, the government police cubes. In actuality, they had people everywhere across the entire country en poste in different little garrisons here and there, that sort of thing. But the part that you see, the actual light blue cubes that you see and move around on the board, that's only the part of the energy in the system that's available to be kinetic and to do kinetic things. So it's not of great importance to show every battalion, every garrison on the map. It's enough to show the potentialities of the side. And of course, when it comes to modeling the insurgent forces, who, if they have battalions and brigades and things like that, it's usually an honorific and not an actual structure. Because in Algeria, for example, the insurgents never fielded anything over a couple of rifle companies in strength, even though they called them battalions and brigades and divisions and so forth. So that's not so important. You just have to leave it kind of abstract. You have to kind of leave it mushy. So maybe you don't count the rifles, but what you do is you do your research on what actually was important, what contributed to the push and the pull of what went on. What enabled one side, what hampered one side, what were the weaknesses of one side that were exploited or missed by the other side, for example. And that's why I always took sort of a broader brush approach, to my games on Algeria, for example. And my game on Somalia, which is, again, an area movement game, almost abstract in its treatment. About the dynamics between tribal groups and different agendas. It's not a very in-depth game, but it's something that again takes that kind of higher level treatment of things. So I don't let that stick me. There is enough that's written generally about many sub-Saharan conflicts where you can suss out the general outlines and suss out what's important, what really affected the conflict as it went on, and what happened, and probably that's enough to build, to build a game on. The problem is history, as always, is written by the victors or at least the survivors, and that is very true of sub-Saharan conflicts. Take, for example, the Nigerian Civil War and Biafran succession. There's only one game on the Biafran War, and that was designed, I cannot remember the name of the designer, but it was a mini game that appeared in an old issue of Against the Odds magazine. And again, I had collected a couple of books on the Biafran War, and they were written by people who were brigadiers or, insurgent commanders or government commanders at the time. And of course, they're written to serve themselves and to serve a political agenda. Scholarship nowadays, of course, tends to be a little bit more balanced, I think, maybe a little bit more inclusive, but contemporary sources, I think they're even less trustworthy. Of course, 30 years ago, that was all you had to go on. And I don't know, Phil, working, 40 years ago on Angola, what kind of resources you might have had to use. But of course, they were quite contemporary to the time. And I don't know if you've ever thought, that you might want to go back and revise the design in light of new scholarship. I would guess maybe not, because, maybe this doesn't, maybe the scholarship's a bit better, but maybe it wouldn't lead you to revise your entire model of the conflict.
That's interesting. Yes, I mean, when 1986, 87, when myself and Roger were putting the game together, we were pre-internet, which is a massive difference between now and then. There was quite a limited amount of stuff that we could lay our hands on. One of the oddest moments was, and I don't know how this got found out, but we got some publicity materials sent through by UNITA, and asking us for, if we were happy to give them a donation towards their costs, which was slightly too close to reality as far as we were concerned. But yeah, I mean, I take your view. I take your point totally that there's very limited information about, the number of aircraft, the type of tanks, things like that. And when we were putting together the balance of forces in Angola, it was more a case of finding the balance between different types of unit to simulate the broad brush strokes of what went on, so that it did simulate the how the different key elements to what was going on in the conflict. But yeah, possibly there are times I think, it'd be nice to just go back and have a look at that part of it again. But there's also a lot of people out there who I think are happy with the game as is anyway, and don't feel the need for it to be revisited.
Yeah, I played it twice last year. Don't change a hair. It's good.
I can't nail my friends down to play it. That's the problem.
Yann, Phil mentioned a moment ago that the humor inside Angola made him uncomfortable, and it is this thing that is true in a lot of conflicts, and certainly can be true in political conflicts and civil wars in particular, where the line between farce and tragedy gets a little blurry. And I wonder if you think, first of all, that we have a special responsibility when dealing with contemporary conflicts, as you are in your Somalia design, to be sensitive to how it's going to be perceived, and whether there is space for this kind of gallows humor, dark humor that that sometimes pops up in war games, and to a certain extent is a real component of some conflicts.
So on this particular aspect, I had the chance to have a very good teacher or tutor in the person of Stefan Wagensas, who designed the British Ways. He's particularly good. He's actually diplomed in treating the aspect of civil wars and some of the very dark aspect of civil wars. My approach for my Somalia design was to take a very academical approach to my source and what I want to depict in the model. So I didn't touch this, humor aspects. I was asking myself what I want my player to learn if I include this element in my game, and if I include it, should I tune it down? Yes or no? And is it also part of the bigger picture of what my model wants to teach people? So there is some self-moderation on this very element. If I think, like talking about Somalia, there are child soldiers. You have like forced enrollments. There was a very impactful famine that I decided to insert as an event in the game, but I didn't insert it because I was like, yes, Somalian famine, that's something that will connect with people will make the connection. No, I decided to include this one event because, for example, there is this case where the insurgents, Al-Shabaab, refused the access of humanitarian agency inside the territories they were holding for political decision, so that people would seek the aid of Al-Shabaab to get food and resources rather than to get them from humanitarian agencies. And this is depicted in the event through action in the game. And that's how I processed the darker aspect, of those conflicts. And I made a filter, and that's how I processed, okay, this is going to make it in design, and maybe in the playbook, I can also extend on this one aspect, which I think the player will not enjoy, that's not the correct word, but will interact with while playing, but also in the playbook, they will have the opportunity to learn the connection between the military aspect or the civil aspect of that, and then how it transpires in the game.
Excellent. We have about 8 minutes left. Although if folks are available for more questions, I think that's fine. But if folks who are tuning in want to ask a few questions, then we can get a chance to do that. Otherwise, I have an extraordinarily long list of questions that we barely scratched the surface of. So I'm happy to fill the time either way. But to avoid like a gap here, can Chris, or rather Yann, do you, this is actually, I guess, for everybody, when you see the headlines that are occurring on basically daily about Somalia and East Africa, Ethiopians rattling sabers to invade Eritrea again, does your experience as a game designer affect how you view these conflicts now, since you have a little more intimacy with them than most members of the public?
May I intervene?
Yeah.
So in my particular case, so Brian and Phil obviously have a long history of designing games. Because Fading Star was my first design, even more than just having a new filter when viewing those headlines, as you said, this motivated me into studying international relations, actually pursuing a master. And I think, okay, this is in my case, it's an exaggeration. It's kind of unique, but the answer is yes, obviously yes. And that's where we have to make the distinction on how all civil society, the West, as in like the general people, conceive those conflicts and how the decision makers saw them. I think there is a big gap, especially in the US, when it comes to African US policy. There is, or that's also the case in France and in Europe, but in the US, I think people are not aware of what are the US influence and the US foreign policy in Africa, be it on the military side, like the ongoing operation, and how between different administration, those policies does not necessarily change over time. And I think in the case of Somalia, when you check how Donald Trump, how Barack Obama, and how now Joe Biden manage those conflicts, there is a continuity. And people, I think the public is not aware of those. And making our games, I think the mission that our games can bring is that making this awareness comes up.
Fantastic. Brian?
I completely agree with Yann, but I have been in the game a long time, and one thing that I learned very quickly was that while every wargamer is interested in history, and they have encyclopedic knowledge of maybe one or two periods of history, by and large, they tend not to be any more interested in current affairs than people who don't play war games. So there is a certain subset of wargame players and wargame designers that are very interested in contemporary conflicts, how to model them, and how to, and using games as a way to understand the conflicts and to teach about them. I'm very, very much in this vein. I've done a lot of work on this over the years. And again, Jason, you called me the foremost designer. I don't think I'm foremost, but I am certainly persistent in this particular vein. One country that we haven't mentioned in the hour or so that we've spent together so far on Modern Africa is China. The whole Belt and Road thing. I've designed a game that's as yet unpublished, but I designed it at the suggestion and connivance of a person in the American military about Belt and Road initiatives and the kind of, the infrastructure and the arrangements around the funding and building and maintenance of these infrastructure projects that are being constructed by China in Africa as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. And you can call it a sort of a new form of imperialism or colonialism, if you will. I'm not exactly sure if it is. But certainly China is making inroads in Africa where the United States and much of Europe dropped the ball long ago. The United States has never really done more than take Africa for granted, I think, in the broad view of things. And Britain and, forgive me, and France have grabbed Africa and shaken it by the neck like a terrier with a rat and dropped it. But I think that, Africa is just, it's a huge continent with millions of people and dozens of countries, so complex, so much potential, so much going on, and people are just ignorant of what's going on. And I think it's a real failing on our part, and I think it's something that we ignore at our peril. So again, I mentioned at the beginning, I would like to do more work on sub-Saharan Africa. There's been a little bit of work on this. I saw you mention about Javier Romero and his World War Africa game, which is another modern title, even though that goes back 20 years. This is something that I would really like to touch on in future in my own design efforts, in my copious spare time, as it were.
Phil?
Yeah, Brian, just the China Belt and Road game idea sounds fascinating. What do you see as being the sides in that particular game? Who would who be representing as part of it?
I know that this kind of that the Belt and Road Initiative has been the subject of a couple of unpublished games, either by students, where I know the professor, or in the professional military. Aaron mentioned a Belt and Road Matrix game. I don't know if you're familiar with Matrix games, Phil, from miniatures. But that's a game that has been played by professional military people. A matrix game is, like essentially competing structured arguments, but you can have a map encounters to kind of amplify and visualize what's going on. You certainly, of course, China is a player, but there's many other countries that could potentially be involved in this. Then there's the countries in Africa that are being engaged by the government. And then there's the factions and tribes, so forth, that are within the countries that are, again, being engaged or not engaged, because tribal politics have been, a constant in modern conflict in Africa, I think far more than the religious angle of things. It's working out the differences between tribes and regions that have been artificially divided in the past by imperial borders and colonial borders is something that's being worked out over the last few years, and I think is still being worked out nowadays, and it's still going to color any kind of conflict that's going on in the future. I'd like to show an interesting old item. This also is from 1977. This is an old game. I think it was number 3 of Wargamer magazine. It came from the UK called Africa.
That looks familiar. It
Yep.
looks familiar.
It's from 1977, and it is interesting because it looks upon Africa almost as a terra nullius. It's just the different players in the game represent the different world powers. You can see there's the Stars and Stripes, the Hammer and Sickle, Britain, all these kinds of things. And it's an influence game where you have a map and counters and people just deploy bits of influence on things. So the African nations on the map themselves aren't really actors. They're only acted upon. And this is very, very 1977 of its time. And of course, Twilight Struggle, which another game we haven't talked about yet, is something that that takes the idea of the domino theory from the 50s and 60s and carries on with that. And that's how Twilight Struggle treats Africa as well, as a collection of adjacent or non-adjacent spaces on the map where you deploy influence and try. So it's a complete outside looking in kind of perspective. There's little variations on that. And I'm sorry, but I haven't had a chance to play the Horn of Africa mini game yet. I got it in the GMT fall winter sale, and I haven't played it yet. But so I can't comment on it. But certainly, I wonder if that takes the same kind of look at it, just in the service of the general conceit of the Twilight Struggle system, which is the domino theory. I don't know. Do you have a comment, Jason?
So there are two things. I have two comments. First of all, I think it's interesting to note that the United States, Africa was part of European Command very conscientiously, and it was U.S. policy, particularly in the immediate aftermath of the independence of most of the sub-Saharan African states, to defer to British and French views of things. And in Twilight Struggle, one of the built-in conceits of the game was that we were going to pretend that no other states besides the Soviet Union and the United States counted, and that included Britain and France. When we did this game, I couldn't pretend that was true anymore. So there are at least a few cards that refer to the fact that, some of this is actually, yes, it's the Americans, but we're kind of relying on France here and Djibouti, and some of the stuff with Ethiopia actually draws back to the British colonial period. Those are just the realities of it. And so you have to give a little truth to the agency that our allies were providing there. But yes, nevertheless, it is still cynical in the sense that, we're pretending that all the other countries of the world are pawns for the US and the Soviet Union to play.
It's really interesting you mentioned that, Jason, because last year I gave a talk trying to modeling the war of influence between France and Russia in the Sahel and the Lake Chad region. And I gave up on the idea because I think it's a concept that made its time in Wargaming, maybe. People are expecting more now, especially mentioning giving more agency to the actual country that we depict in those games. So there may be new ways to do that. But Twilight Struggle already is great, nevertheless.
One thing that I will say that I think is true is in very many instances, we Americans, again, sort of out of ignorance, will characterize some of these conflicts as proxy wars, and particularly that's how we would have described the war, the Ogaden War between Somalia and Ethiopia. But in point of fact, Somalia and Ethiopia have centuries of conflict under their belts, and it's unclear to me who precisely was using whom in that sense. Now, American policy and Soviet policy at the time, where we just dumped trundles full of weapons into very unstable countries, that seems to me to be our problem. But in terms of was this really a conflict about competing ideologies and whether Ethiopia should be part of the East or the West? That I have my doubts about. And Phil's game, actually, Angola also kind of hints at this a little bit, that, there are things going on there, and to some element, it seems that the superpowers are a little bit dupes in a conflict that's going to go on one way or the other.
Yes. I mean, I think when you design any game, you have to make compromises, don't you? You've got, as we were saying earlier about order of battle, you've got, on the one hand, you're wanting to simulate everything, but on the other hand, that's not possible at all. I mean, going back to Angola, there were all sorts of elements to the actual conflict. And just to take one small element, Cabinda was an MPLA-controlled enclave and a source of all the petroleum that Angola produced, which of course is of great interest to the West. Within the game, that is simulated almost as part of the military conflict, but it wasn't. It was, much more closely related to the sort of counterinsurgency operations that, are more appropriate to the games that Brian and Yann have been describing. But you can't do everything, can you, in a simulation? So you just have to accept that it isn't the perfect picture at all.
Yes, well, as Volko is always fond of saying, all models are flawed, but some are useful. So that's what we're aiming for here. Well, gentlemen, this has been a fantastic conversation, and I hope just the first of several. I'm definitely looking forward to more of your work. Phil, I love everything the Ragnar brothers put out, so you guys keep churning away. And I've already backed Yann's game on the P500, so I've done my due diligence. Brian, I can't possibly buy all your games, but but I enjoy quite a few of them.
Even I'm not a Brian Train completist.
But thank you all for participating and for staying up late or getting up early in Jan's case, whatever time zone he's on. And
it was a long night.
But I know we all share this common view that we need more conflict simulations that deal with this subject, and more interest from the hobby in general in these kinds of games. And I appreciate all of your thoughts and insights for our audience today.
Thank you very much for inviting us.
Thank you, Jason.
It's been great.
Thank you. Very pleasant talking.